Well, I want to welcome you here to what we're now calling Reflections on Sunday's Sermon. We're going to try to do this on a regular basis where after Sunday we'll take some time together and share with you some added thoughts about what we've learned or what more information we'd like to give to you about the sermons. Remember, we just had Easter Sunday. It was the day that we reflected on the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And my hope is that it inspired you not only to think about the resurrection as the coming to life again of our Lord, but the empowering of each one of us by the power that was unleashed on our Lord Jesus Christ from God the Father and raising him from the dead. And so we talk about that through his resurrection. You and I have power of resurrection in our own lives. Now, on Sunday, we really only looked at the first 8 verses of chapter 16 of the book of Mark. And if you remember, it was all about Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Lesser, one of the disciples, and then Salome, who was the mother of James and John. And they were making their way to the tomb early in the morning to anoint the body of Jesus with spices. They probably had bought them a couple days earlier, right before the Passover, and were waiting to find that opportunity to go and anoint the body of Jesus. The problem for them is that they didn't know how to get past the stone that had been put in place. And so that was the big question in their minds: who's going to roll the stone away? The big discovery that they discovered is that it was already done when they got there. And when they saw that it had been moved, Mary Magdalene just thought the worst, and so she turns and she runs back to tell Peter to let him know what was going on. As she's doing that, the other 2 women continue on to the tomb, and they look inside the tomb, and that's when they see not the body of Jesus, but that's when they see this young man sitting there at the right side of where Jesus had been laid. And he speaks to them and he says, "You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He's been raised. Go and tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee." I mean, talk about a tremendous message to share. I mean, I just think of how, if I had seen that, I would want to share it with everybody. And you think that these women would want to do the same thing. But the Bible actually says that they were so overcome by fear and astonishment that they didn't say anything to anybody. We don't really know what became of them. They just left the tomb and they went off by themselves. And so this wonderful news is not going anywhere at all. So how does it get to the disciples? Well, Mark tells us that a couple things happen. First of all, Mary Magdalene eventually meets Jesus before the day's done. She runs back to the disciples and tells them that she had just met Jesus. They don't believe her. It's too hard for them to believe. And then in verse 12, we find the 2 men who Luke describes as going to the village of Emmaus. They meet Jesus, the risen Jesus, and Mark here tells us that they go back, find the disciples, and they tell the disciples their story. And again, the disciples up in the upper room don't believe them. Finally, Jesus himself shows up in his resurrected body, and now they believe. But that causes Jesus to rebuke them for not believing in the witness of Mary and believing in the witness of these 2 men who had come back from the town of Emmaus. And then Jesus gives them a commission as the story goes on in Mark. He gives them a commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel to everybody. He then tells them that whoever believes and is baptized, they'll be saved, but whoever doesn't believe is going to be condemned. He then gives them 6 signs that will accompany those who do believe, so that they can know that what they're believing in is genuine. And finally, Mark includes the disciples actually seeing Jesus Christ being raised up into heaven, and they see him. One of the unique things about their story is that they see Jesus not just taken up into the clouds, but they actually witness Jesus sitting at the right side of God the Father in heaven. And the whole story culminates. He ends his gospel with the idea that they go out and preach the gospel everywhere under the power of God, and the gospel now has a powerful effect on the world around them. And that really completes the Gospel of Mark. It's a great ending. It's a great way to end the gospel. And now this is where the problem comes in our Bibles, because as you read the story, all of a sudden you can come to what's here in between, and let me just read it as in my Bible it shows it, right between chapter 16, verse 8 and verse 9, it says, "Most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 through 20." Okay? I don't know if you've ever seen that in the Bible, but it's kind of a bummer when when you look at that. You're reading along and all of a sudden you find out that according to some people, these scholars, that Mark never even wrote this part of the gospel, that somebody else included it. And really his ending was in the end of verse 8, where it says, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." And that's how many believe that Mark ended his gospel. Who ends a good story like that? That's a good question for us to ask. Why would Mark end it like that? The editorial comment has caused many people to even question, though, why even should I read verses 9 through 20, and why should I even believe that they should be in the Bible? So it's raised some confusion. That's what I want to talk a little bit about. So as I kind of reflect upon our message on Sunday, I want to talk a little bit about why we can have confidence, why I have confidence that when Mark wrote the gospel, he didn't end in verse 8, but he ended in verse 20. And I hope that you and I will believe that as well, so that we take this latter edition as really part of what Mark had written. So let me say a couple things. Here's why I believe that, why I think Mark's gospel was all the way to verse 20 and didn't end in verse 8. Of the thousands of manuscripts that we have thousands of manuscripts, some fragments, some more complete, but we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts that include Mark's gospel. 99% of those manuscripts include Mark 16, 9 through 20. That's a pretty high percentage when you think about it. It would be pretty great if it was 60% or 80%. It's way beyond that. It's 99% of them, which means that the majority view of all manuscripts strongly favor the understanding that the Gospel of Mark went all the way to the end of verse 20. And so why is the 1%, why did that move the needle in some of these scholars to the point where some scholars doubted that Mark wrote these verses? Well, most will say that it's because of two manuscripts that we have today that were discovered a number of years ago, a couple centuries ago, but we have them today. One manuscript is called Codex Sinaiticus, and the other is called Codex Vaticanus. One was found in the monastery by Sinai. The other was found in the library in the Vatican. Both were written in book forms. That's why they're called codexes. Codex means that there's pages that you can turn, so it's not like a scroll that you would unroll, but it would be a book that you would read like we read a book as well. Both were written in the 4th century AD, which means that it wasn't written in the 1st century, it wasn't written in the 2nd century, it wasn't written in the 3rd century, but it was written in the 4th century AD. What makes them so unique, though, and why scholars give such weight to them, is because they were nearly complete manuscripts. In other words, here's what they represent. They represent the earliest near complete manuscripts that we have to date of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so these are the ones that scholars will go back when they want to write a translation of the Bible. New translations of the Bible, they go back to the two primary manuscripts and use them as their primary source of the scriptures themselves, because these are the earliest, most complete manuscripts, and as I said, they have highly influenced the translation work of modern Bible versions. And when you look at both of these manuscripts, neither of them include Mark 16, 9 through 20. And that's why there's a question about if that's really in the Bible. But here's the thing. Both of these will leave out other portions of the Bible as well. So let's look at the Codex Vaticanus, the one that was found in the library in the Vatican. It's missing Genesis 1 through 46. It's missing Psalms 106 all the way through Psalm 108. It's not there in their manuscript. It's missing Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. It's missing Romans 16, verse 24. It's missing the epistles, the pastoral epistles completely. It's missing the book of Revelation completely as well. And so there were these missing passages that are in this manuscript that is considered so influential that it is being used to write and translate most of the New Testament and some of the Old Testament. The Codex Sinaiticus is also missing portions of the Old Testament and New Testament. I could go through some of those. It's not as extensive, but it doesn't actually start the Old Testament passages until I think almost the First Chronicles. So all that part of the Old Testament has been missing, never found, and never included. And here's the question it raises in my mind then. Is Mark 6, 9 through 20 not included because they never existed? So Mark never wrote them? Or is Mark 16, 9 through 20 not included because somehow they got lost? Okay, I'm in the stance because there's so many other manuscripts that include Mark 16, 9 through 20 that somehow they were lost, and that's why they were omitted. It's not because Mark never wrote these words, but he wrote them, but somehow in the history of manuscripts, they got lost. And so my thought is that if we have 99% of the thousands of manuscripts that are included in these verses, I mean, that's a pretty strong argument to me that these verses were included by Mark, and that as we read the Gospels, we want to read all the way to verse 20. Here's the other thing. We know that the writings of the early church fathers, dating back all the way to the 2nd century, they preached from and they quoted from Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. And it wasn't just a few of them that did that. We have over 100 records of early church fathers using this as source material for a sermon they would preach or a teaching they would give. So they relied on Mark 16, 9 through 20. The earliest ones that we have actually was a man named Justin Martyr, who lived at 155 AD, and so that was just a little over 100 years since Christ was around, and he used this, and Irenaeus, about 30 years later, used it as well. And so there were, as I said, 100 of these early church fathers who relied on this text and based some of their teaching upon it. And so that, to me, gives authenticity to the fact that this was written by Mark. Otherwise, why would they use this if it wasn't around at that point and they were questioning the validity of these verses? And so all I'm saying is this. We got a great gospel story. And Mark, I'm convinced he took his gospel all the way to the point where they went out and shared the gospel with others, as Jesus had told them to do. And as we read this gospel account, let's read it as the other gospel writers completed theirs, Matthew and Luke, where they bring theirs to completion with the Great Commission by our Lord Jesus Christ. I believe Mark did the same as well. So let's not stop it where the women run away afraid. Let's stop it where the disciples go out to bring good news to the whole world. That's my thoughts for today. I hope you enjoyed it and you've found something that you can use in it. Have a good day.